The black SUVs rolled into the quiet cul-de-sac just after dawn on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, their presence an immediate rupture in the careful calm of suburban Ontario life. Neighbors pulling out of driveways for their morning commute slowed to watch as officers in tactical vests emerged, their movements practiced and purposeful. The target was number 47, a modest two-story home with neat flower beds and a basketball hoop over the garage. Inside, a man named David Brennan was finishing his coffee, scrolling through his phone, probably thinking about his day ahead at the accounting firm where he'd worked for the past 15 years. He had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, everything he'd built over 22 years would collapse. By the time the knock came, hard and official, his neighbors were already recording on their phones. When David Brennan was led out in handcuffs, his face blank with shock, a woman across the street dropped her travel mug on the driveway. She knew him. Everyone knew him. He coached Little League. He organized the neighborhood watch. And according to the warrant being executed that morning, he was also a murderer who had been hiding in plain sight since the summer of 2002. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light and ensures that victims like the one at the center of this case are never forgotten. The arrest of David Brennan sent shockwaves through Millbrook, Ontario, a town of roughly 15,000 people nestled in the rolling farmland east of Toronto. This wasn't just another crime story. This was the resolution of a case that had haunted the community for more than 2 decades, a murder so brutal and seemingly random that it had transformed the town's sense of itself. The victim's name was Jennifer Hayes, and in the summer of 2002, she was 23 years old with everything to live for. Her murder had been the kind of tragedy that fractures a community's innocence, the kind that parents reference when wanting their children, the kind that detectives carry with them long after retirement. For 22 years, Jennifer's family had waited for answers. For 22 years, someone in Millbrook had been carrying a terrible secret, and now, thanks to advances in DNA technology that didn't exist when Jennifer died, that secret was finally exposed. The man being arrested wasn't a stranger, wasn't a drifter passing through, wasn't some phantom the community could imagine as an outsider. He was one of them, and that made everything so much worse. To understand the weight of this arrest, you have to understand who Jennifer Hayes was. In the spring and summer of 2002, Jennifer was living the kind of life that small-town girls dream about when they're planning their futures. She'd graduated from Millbrook District High School 5 years earlier, one of those students everyone remembered fondly, the kind who made teachers smile when her name came up years later. She wasn't the valedictorian or the prom queen, but she was well-liked, genuinely kind, the sort of person who remembered your birthday and brought homemade cookies to work just because. After high school, she'd taken courses at the local community college while working part-time at a daycare, discovering that she had a natural gift with children. Kids gravitated to her. Parents trusted her. By 2002, she was the assistant director at Little Sprouts Daycare on Main Street, a job she loved and excelled at. Jennifer still lived at home with her parents, Tom and Patricia Hayes, in a blue bungalow on Riverside Drive. It was a temporary arrangement, or so everyone thought. She was saving money, planning to move to Toronto with her best friend Sarah in the fall. They'd already started looking at apartments online, circling listings in the Star, dreaming about city life and independence. Jennifer had a bulletin board in her bedroom covered with pictures cut from magazines, places she wanted to visit, things she wanted to do. Paris, New York, the Grand Canyon. She'd never been on a plane, but she had a passport ready and a growing savings account. She was careful with money, practical, always thinking ahead. Her parents would later say that quality made her murder even more incomprehensible. Jennifer wasn't reckless. She didn't take risks. She was the daughter who called if she was going to be late, who always let them know where she was. That summer, Jennifer was dating someone casually, a guy named Marcus who worked at the Canadian Tire on the highway. It wasn't serious, nothing she'd introduced to her parents officially, but her friends knew about him. She'd mention him at work, show texts on her phone, smile in that particular way people do when they're in the early stages of something that might become real. She had a close circle of girlfriends from high school, women she'd known since elementary school, the kind of friends who knew all your stories and still wanted to hear them again. They met for coffee every Sunday at Tim Hortons, a ritual they'd maintained since graduation. Jennifer never missed it. Her life had a rhythm, a comforting predictability. Weekdays at the daycare, weekends with friends and family, the occasional night out at the Millbrook Tavern, the only real bar in town, where everyone ended up eventually. It was a small life, maybe by some standards, but it was hers, and she seemed happy in it. The town of Millbrook in 2002 was the kind of place where that sort of life made sense. It wasn't quite rural, not quite suburban, but something in between. There were farms on the outskirts and subdivisions near the center, a main street with local businesses that had been there for generations, a single high school that everyone attended, a hockey rink that served as the community's winter heartbeat. People didn't lock their doors. Kids rode bikes until dark. Everyone knew the police officers by their first names because there were only a handful of them, and they'd probably gone to school with your older brother. Crime meant the occasional drunk and disorderly petty theft, teenagers getting caught with pot behind the grocery store. Serious crime was something that happened in Toronto, something you read about in the newspaper while shaking your head, grateful it wasn't your problem. That innocence, that sense of safety, was an invisible thing the community took for granted, until Jennifer Hayes was murdered. Then everything changed. In the weeks before she died, Jennifer seemed completely normal. Her co-workers would later rack their brains trying to remember if she'd seemed worried or afraid, if she'd mentioned anything unusual, but there was nothing. She was her regular self, cheerful, reliable, maybe a little tired from the long hours at the daycare and the heat of late July, but nothing concerning. She'd been talking about the Toronto move more frequently, getting excited, making plans. She bought a new purse and a professional-looking blazer from the outlet mall, preparing for job interviews in the city. Her mom, Patricia, had been both proud and sad, the normal mixture of emotions that come with watching your child prepare to leave home. They'd been baking together more often, Patricia's way of spending time with her daughter before she moved away. Tom had been quietly fixing things around the house, changing the oil in Jennifer's car, making sure everything was in working order, doing all the practical things fathers do when they can't quite articulate their feelings. But there was one thing, one small detail that would later take on enormous significance. About 2 weeks before she died, Jennifer had mentioned to Sarah that she'd run into someone from her past, someone she hadn't seen in a while. She'd been vague about it, dismissive almost, saying it was just weird to see how people change. Sarah hadn't pressed for details. It seemed like nothing, the kind of random encounter that happens in small towns where everyone's history overlaps. Jennifer hadn't seemed upset about it, just thoughtful. She changed the subject quickly, moved on to talking about Toronto apartments and what furniture they'd need to buy. The moment passed, forgotten in the flow of normal life. Sarah wouldn't remember that conversation until weeks later, when detectives were interviewing everyone who'd known Jennifer, searching desperately for any clue about who might have wanted to hurt her. The last time Jennifer's parents saw their daughter alive was on the evening of July 27, 2002. It was a Saturday, warm and humid in that particular way Ontario summer nights can be, the air thick enough to feel. Jennifer had been home most of the day, lazy and relaxed, watching movies with her mom, helping her dad in the garden. Around 7 in the evening, she'd gotten a call on her cell phone, one of those early flip phones that seemed so high-tech at the time. She'd taken it in her room, and when she emerged 15 minutes later, she said she was going out to meet some friends. Patricia asked where, the automatic parent question, and Jennifer said probably the tavern, maybe just driving around, she wasn't sure yet. She'd be back by midnight. She kissed her mom on the cheek, grabbed her purse, called out goodbye to her dad in the garage. She was wearing jean shorts and a white tank top, her brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked young and pretty and completely unworried. Tom would later say he'd been under the car, changing the oil, and he'd only called out goodbye without seeing her. That haunted him for years, that his last image of his daughter was from the previous moment, not that final goodbye. Patricia watched from the doorway as Jennifer backed out of the driveway in her red Honda Civic, the one with the dream catcher hanging from the rearview mirror, and that was it. That was the last time anyone who loved Jennifer Hayes saw her alive. The call came into the Millbrook police station at 6:43 on Sunday morning, July 28, 2002. A man walking his dog along the trail system behind the old railway tracks had found something in the brush near the creek. He'd been stammering on the phone, barely coherent, repeating that officers needed to come right away, that it was bad, that he thought it was a person. Constable Mark Rivera was the first to arrive, pulling his cruiser onto the gravel access road and making his way down the overgrown path the caller had described. The morning was already hot, the air filled with the sound of cicadas and the smell of wild grass baking in early sunlight. Rivera had been with the Millbrook police for 6 years and had seen his share of calls that turned out to be nothing, deer carcasses or discarded mannequins that spooked early morning joggers. He was hoping this would be another false alarm. But when he pushed through the dense brush near the creek bed, when he saw what was lying there in the dappled shade of the cottonwood trees, he knew immediately that this was different. This was real. He radioed for backup in the coroner with hands that shook slightly, and within 20 minutes the peaceful morning calm of that remote trail was shattered by the arrival of emergency vehicles, yellow crime scene tape, and the grim machinery of a homicide investigation. Jennifer Hayes had been dead for several hours by the time they found her. The medical examiner would later determine she died sometime between 11 p.m. Saturday night and 2 a.m. Sunday morning. Cheap and strangled, the bruising on her neck clear and brutal, the kind of violence that spoke to rage or panic or both. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that she'd fought back, that she'd tried desperately to survive. Her clothing was partially torn, suggesting a struggle, though the examiner would determine there was no sexual assault, a small mercy in an otherwise merciless crime. Her purse was missing, along with her cell phone and car keys. Her red Honda Civic was nowhere near the scene. The location itself was significant, detectives would later note. The trail system behind the railway tracks wasn't somewhere you ended up by accident. It was secluded, rarely used after dark, known locally as a spot where teenagers sometimes went to drink or make out away from adult supervision. Whoever had brought Jennifer there or lured her there knew the area, knew it would be quiet, knew there would be no witnesses. By noon that Sunday, the news had begun to spread through Millbrook in the way that terrible news always does in small towns. A whispered wave of horror moving from house to house, phone call to phone call. A young woman had been found dead, murdered. The police weren't releasing the name yet, pending notification of family, but people were already guessing, already running through mental lists of young women they knew, praying it wasn't their daughter, their niece, their coworker. Tom and Patricia Hayes were in their kitchen making lunch when the knock came at their door. They'd spent the morning worried, increasingly frantic as Jennifer's midnight curfew had come and gone without word, as her phone went straight to voicemail, as the morning stretched on with no sign of their daughter. When Patricia opened the door and saw Constable Rivera standing there with Sergeant Linda Walsh, both of them wearing expressions of practiced sympathy and barely concealed grief, she knew before they said a word. The sound she made, that first cry of understanding, would stay with Rivera for the rest of his career. Some sounds you never forget. The investigation that followed was the most intensive Millbrook had ever seen. Within 48 hours, the Ontario Provincial Police had sent additional detectives to assist. The small station became a command center, phones ringing constantly, officers working double shifts. The conference room transformed into a war room with maps and timelines and photographs covering every available surface. The focus initially was on Jennifer's last known movements. Security footage from the Millbrook Tavern showed she'd been there Saturday night, arriving around 8:30. She'd been with her friend Sarah and 2 other women from their high school group. The footage showed them laughing, ordering drinks, nothing unusual. Jennifer had been wearing what her mother said she'd left the house in, the jean shorts and white tank top. She'd seemed happy, relaxed, checking her phone occasionally, but not in a way that suggested worry or anticipation. Around 10:15, the footage showed Jennifer saying goodbye to her friends and leaving alone. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Sarah told detectives that Jennifer had mentioned needing to meet someone briefly, that she'd be home soon. When Sarah asked who, Jennifer had been vague, said it was just something she needed to take care of, nothing serious. She'd hugged her friends goodbye and walked out into the summer night. The parking lot footage showed her getting into her red Civic alone and driving away. After that, the trail went cold. No other cameras caught her car. No witnesses came forward saying they'd seen her after 10:15. It was as if she'd driven into a void. Detectives canvassed the town systematically, knocking on doors, showing Jennifer's photo, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual Saturday night. The responses were heartbreaking in their consistency. Everyone knew Jennifer. Everyone liked her. No one could imagine who would want to hurt her. The discovery of Jennifer's car 3 days later provided more questions than answers. A farmer found it parked behind an abandoned barn about 5 kilometers from where her body had been discovered. The keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet intact, cash and credit cards untouched. Her cell phone was missing, never recovered despite extensive searches of the area. The car's location suggested the killer had driven it there after the murder, possibly walking back to his own vehicle or to town. Police processed the car meticulously, lifting fingerprints, collecting fiber evidence, swabbing for DNA. They found Jennifer's fingerprints throughout, as expected. They found several of the sets of prints belonging to her parents, her friends, Marcus the boyfriend, all easily explained and eliminated. But they also found a partial print on the rearview mirror that didn't match anyone in their initial pool of suspects, and DNA on the driver's side door handle that was male and unknown. In 2002, this was significant evidence, but also frustratingly limited. DNA technology existed, but the databases were relatively small. The unknown male DNA was entered into the system and came back with no matches. Without a suspect to compare it to, the DNA was just data, a genetic fingerprint of someone who could be anyone. The list of potential suspects was both too long and too short. Marcus, the casual boyfriend, was brought in for questioning within the first week. He had an alibi, corroborated by multiple witnesses. He'd been at a friend's house Saturday night playing video games until 3 in the morning, something 5 other people confirmed. He was devastated by Jennifer's death, clearly genuine in his grief, and detectives quickly moved on. They looked at ex-boyfriends from high school, finding 2 serious relationships in Jennifer's past. Both young men still lived in the area. Both were interviewed extensively. One had been at a family reunion in Ottawa that weekend with dozens of witnesses. The other had been working the night shift at a factory in Peterborough. Time cards and co-workers confirming his presence. Dead ends, both of them. They investigated random stranger theories, looking at sexual offenders in the region, anyone with a history of violence against women. Several were interviewed and cleared. The DNA evidence, when compared, excluded them all. Then there was David Brennan. He came up early in the investigation, but not as a suspect initially. David had been a regular customer at Little Sprouts Daycare. His daughter Emma had attended there for 2 years before moving on to kindergarten in 2001. Jennifer had been Emma's favorite teacher. David had always been friendly when dropping off or picking up his daughter, chatting with Jennifer about Emma's day, sometimes bringing coffee for the staff on cold mornings. He was known around town as a decent guy, an accountant who did taxes for half the local businesses, a volunteer who helped organize community events. When detectives were interviewing everyone who'd known Jennifer through work, David was on the list. He came in voluntarily, sat down in the interview room, expressed shock and sadness about what had happened. He said he'd always thought highly of Jennifer, that Emma had loved her. He was asked about his whereabouts Saturday night. He said he'd been home with his wife Linda and their daughter, watching a movie, going to bed around 11. Linda confirmed this when detectives spoke to her separately. David's DNA was collected as part of the broad sweep they were doing of anyone who'd known Jennifer, a standard procedure to build their elimination database. When it was compared to the unknown DNA from the car door handle, it was inconclusive. The sample from the car was partial, degraded by heat and time. The technology in 2002 couldn't definitively match or exclude David based on what they had. Without other evidence pointing to him, without any apparent motive, without any witnesses placing him with Jennifer that night, detectives moved on. David Brennan remained in the file as someone interviewed and cleared, nothing more. The funeral for Jennifer Hayes was held on a Thursday afternoon in early August at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church on Main Street. The church seated 300 people and was standing room only. Overflow mourners gathered on the lawn outside in the brutal summer heat. The entire daycare staff attended, many of them weeping openly. Jennifer's friends from high school sat together in a row, Sarah in the middle, her face blank with shock that hadn't yet transformed into grief. Marcus came, sitting in the back, looking lost. David Brennan attended with his wife and daughter, signing the condolence book, expressing sympathy to Tom and Patricia in the receiving line. The whole town seemed to be there, united in sorrow and confusion and fear. The minister spoke about Jennifer's kindness, her love of children, the brightness she'd brought to the world. Her father tried to speak but couldn't get through more than a few sentences before breaking down. Her mother sat silent, staring at the closed casket. her face a mask of anguish. Outside, news cameras had gathered, reporters from Toronto covering the story of a small-town murder that had shaken rural Ontario. Jennifer Hayes became a name, a headline, a cautionary tale. And then, as weeks turned to months, as the investigation continued to produce no arrests, she became a cold case. The years that followed were a special kind of torture for everyone who'd loved Jennifer. Tom Hayes retired from his job at the mill 2 years after her death, unable to focus, unable to find meaning in the routine of normal life. He spent his days driving around Millbrook, following up on tips that police had already investigated, talking to anyone who might remember something new. He became a fixture at the police station, coming in weekly to ask about progress, to remind them his daughter's case was still unsolved. The detectives were sympathetic, but had little to offer. Without new evidence, without new leads, the case had stalled. Patricia stopped going to church, stopped seeing friends, withdrew into a grief so profound it seemed to physically shrink her. She kept Jennifer's room exactly as it had been, the bulletin board still covered with pictures of places her daughter would never see. She slept in there sometimes, curled up on Jennifer's childhood bed, surrounded by memories. Sarah moved to Toronto as planned, but alone, carrying guilt that she'd left the tavern that night without Jennifer, that maybe if she'd stayed, things would have been different. She never finished her degree. She came home to Millbrook frequently, visiting Jennifer's grave, leaving flowers, talking to a headstone like it could answer back. In 2005, a new detective named James Chen was assigned to the cold case unit. He inherited Jennifer's file, a banker's box full of reports and evidence logs and dead-end leads. Chen was thorough, methodical, the kind of investigator who couldn't let go of unanswered questions. He re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, submitted the DNA samples for testing with newer technology that had emerged since 2002. The results were better, clearer, confirming that the DNA on the car door handle was definitely male and definitely not anyone in the existing database. But still no match. Chen kept the file on his desk, kept Jennifer's high school graduation photo pinned to his bulletin board. He made a habit of calling Tom and Patricia on Jennifer's birthday each year, letting them know he hadn't forgotten. In 2010, he submitted the DNA again to a national database that had expanded significantly. Still nothing. In 2015, he tried again, and again, nothing. The person whose DNA was on Jennifer's car door had never been arrested for any crime that required DNA submission. They were a ghost, invisible in every system designed to catch them. Meanwhile, life in Millbrook continued. New families moved in. Babies were born. The high school graduated new classes every June. The hockey rink got renovated. Main Street businesses changed hands. David Brennan's accounting firm grew. His daughter Emma graduated high school, went off to university. He and Linda celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. He coached Little League, organized the neighborhood watch, remained the kind of dependable, unremarkable citizen that small towns are built on. If he thought about Jennifer Hayes at all, if her murder weighed on him in private moments, no one could tell. He seemed content, settled, just another middle-aged man living an ordinary life. And that ordinariness, that ability to blend in and seem normal, was perhaps the most terrifying thing about him. Because somewhere in that ordinary exterior was someone who had taken a young woman's life and then gone home to sleep peacefully, someone who had attended her funeral and hugged her parents and carried on like nothing had happened. Somewhere behind that friendly, familiar face was a killer. And for 22 years, no one knew. The breakthrough that would finally crack Jennifer Hayes' case didn't come from traditional detective work or a deathbed confession or a witness suddenly remembering a crucial detail. It came from science, from a technology that didn't exist in 2002 and was barely imagined even a decade later. In the spring of 2023, Detective James Chen attended a conference in Toronto on advances in forensic investigation. He was in his early 60s by then, approaching retirement, but still carrying Jennifer's file like a weight he couldn't put down. At the conference, he sat through a presentation on forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had begun solving cold cases across North America with startling success. The concept was relatively simple, but revolutionary in its implications. Instead of just comparing crime scene DNA to criminal databases, investigators could now upload DNA profiles to public genealogy websites where millions of people had submitted their genetic information hoping to find distant relatives or learn about their ancestry. By analyzing these matches, building family trees, and systematically narrowing down branches, investigators could identify suspects even if the suspects themselves had never submitted DNA anywhere. It was the method that had caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, and since then, it had been quietly solving decades-old cases that everyone had assumed would remain mysteries forever. Chen left that conference energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. Within a week, he'd gotten approval from his superiors to submit Jennifer's case to a specialized forensic genealogy company in Virginia that worked with law enforcement. The DNA sample from the car door handle, carefully preserved for over 2 decades, was sent off with hope that felt almost dangerous to indulge. The process wasn't fast. Building a genetic family tree from DNA matches is painstaking work, requiring expertise in both genetics and genealogical research. Analysts had to identify third and fourth cousins from the DNA matches, then work backwards through birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data to construct family trees going back generations. Then they had to work forward, following each branch, eliminating people based on age, location, gender, until they arrived at a pool of potential suspects. For Jennifer's case, this process took 4 months. 4 months during which Chen told no one, not even Tom and Patricia Hayes, because he couldn't bear to give them hope that might lead nowhere. He'd done that too many times over the years, following leads that dissolved into nothing, watching their faces fall when he had to admit he still had no answers. In September 2023, Chen received the report. The genealogist had identified a family cluster in eastern Ontario that matched the DNA profile. Working through the branches of that family tree, considering the age range of the suspect based on witness descriptions and the physical nature of the crime, factoring in location and opportunity, they had narrowed it down to 4 possible individuals. 4 men who shared the right genetic markers, who were the right age in 2002, who had lived in or near Millbrook at the time of Jennifer's murder. Chen's hands were shaking as he read through the names. The third name on the list was David Brennan. Chen stared at it for a long moment, memory clicking into place. David Brennan had been interviewed in 2002. His DNA had been collected but had come back inconclusive because of the limitations of the technology at the time. He'd been cleared, and the investigation had moved on. But here he was, identified through his extended family's genetic information as a potential match to the killer's DNA. Chen pulled the original case file, found the interview notes from 2002, read through them with new eyes. David had known Jennifer through the daycare. He'd been friendly with her. He'd claimed to be home with his wife the night of the murder, an alibi that had never been seriously tested because there had been no reason to doubt him. Now, there was reason. Chen knew he had to be careful. Genetic genealogy provided investigative leads, but it wasn't enough for an arrest. He needed direct DNA comparison to be absolutely certain, and he needed it obtained legally in a way that would hold up in court. For the next 3 months, Chen and a small team of investigators conducted surveillance on David Brennan. They watched him go to work, go home, run errands, live his normal life, all while knowing he might be the man who'd strangled Jennifer Hayes and left her body in the woods 21 years earlier. The surveillance was agonizing, waiting for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample without alerting David that he was under investigation. In early December, the opportunity came. David went to a coffee shop in Peterborough, a town about 30 minutes from Millbrook, where he had a client meeting. He ordered a large coffee, sat at a table for an hour working on his laptop, then left. The coffee cup went into the trash. Detectives retrieved it, bagged it, sent it to the lab for analysis. The DNA on the cup rim was compared to the DNA from Jennifer's car door handle, this time using technology that was light years beyond what had existed in 2002. The match came back definitive. David Brennan's DNA was on Jennifer Hayes' car. The probability of it being anyone else was 1 in several trillion. After 21 years, they finally had their answer. But having an answer and understanding it were 2 different things. As investigators dug deeper into David Brennan's life, looking for evidence of motive or prior suspicious behavior, they found almost nothing. His record was clean, not even a speeding ticket. His colleagues described him as professional, reliable, maybe a bit boring, but in a comfortable way. His neighbors said he was friendly, always willing to help with a project or watch your house while you were on vacation. His wife Linda seemed devoted to him, their marriage apparently stable and happy. His daughter Emma spoke to investigators willingly, confused and defensive, insisting there must be some mistake because her father was a good man who'd never hurt anyone. On the surface, David Brennan was the last person you'd suspect of murder. But investigators knew that surface appearances meant nothing. They began reconstructing David's life in 2002, looking for cracks in the facade. What they found was interesting. In early 2002, David's accounting business had been struggling. He'd taken on debt, made some risky investments that hadn't paid off. His marriage had been strained, according to a former neighbor who remembered arguments, tension, Linda spending time at her mother's house. By summer 2002, things had stabilized somewhat, but there had been pressure, stress, the kind of circumstances that could push someone toward desperate or irrational action. But why Jennifer? That was the question that haunted investigators. What had brought David Brennan and Jennifer Hayes together on that July night? The answer, when it finally emerged, came from an unlikely source. In January 2024, investigators re-interviewed everyone who'd been close to Jennifer in 2002, showing them David's photo, asking if they remembered Jennifer ever mentioning him beyond the daycare connection. Sarah, Jennifer's best friend, who was now 44 and living in Burlington with 2 teenagers of her own, looked at the photo for a long time. Then she remembered something, a fragment of conversation from that last summer. She'd forgotten about it completely, the way you forget small details that seem meaningless until suddenly they're not. Jennifer had mentioned running into someone from the daycare, one of the parents. She'd said he'd been a little too friendly, a little too interested in her life, asking personal questions about her plans to move to Toronto, whether she was seeing anyone seriously. Jennifer had laughed it off at the time, said it was probably nothing, just awkward small talk. But she'd also said she'd agreed to meet him for coffee to talk about Emma, the daughter, because he'd said he was worried about how Emma was adjusting to kindergarten and thought Jennifer might have advice. Sarah told investigators this meeting was supposed to happen that last Saturday, the day Jennifer died. Jennifer had mentioned it casually, said she'd probably stop by after the tavern, keep it short, be home by midnight. She hadn't seemed worried about it. She trusted him. He was Emma's dad. He was harmless. Armed with this information, investigators built their case. They obtained a warrant to search David Brennan's home and vehicle, looking for any physical evidence that might have survived 2 decades. They found nothing directly linking him to the crime scene, which wasn't surprising given the time that had passed. But they did find something interesting in his computer's browsing history. David had been searching Jennifer's name periodically over the years, reading news articles about the unsolved case, visiting memorial pages. He'd also been active on true crime forums, discussing unsolved murders with the kind of detailed knowledge that suggested obsessive interest. In one post from 2015, he'd speculated about the Jennifer Hayes case, suggesting the killer was probably someone who knew her casually, someone she trusted enough to meet alone. He'd written that the killer had probably panicked, that it had gotten out of hand, that he was likely living with tremendous guilt. It was chilling, reading those words now, understanding that David had been writing about himself, confessing in plain sight while hiding behind internet anonymity. On March 12, 2024, the arrest warrant was issued. The tactical team was assembled. At 6:30 the next morning, they rolled into that quiet cul-de-sac where David Brennan had lived peacefully for 15 years, and they took him into custody. At the station, in an interview room that looked exactly like the one where he'd sat 22 years earlier as a witness being cleared, David was read his rights and shown the evidence against him, the DNA match, Sarah's testimony about the planned meeting, his own internet activity. For 3 hours, he said nothing, sitting with his arms crossed, staring at the table. Then, perhaps realizing the scientific evidence was unassailable, perhaps exhausted from carrying the secret for so long, he started talking. What came out was a story of obsession, rejection, and violence that had been festering beneath his ordinary life for more than 2 decades. David admitted he'd been attracted to Jennifer, had developed feelings that went beyond the appropriate boundary between parent and teacher. When Emma left the daycare, he'd found excuses to stay in contact, showing up at community events he knew Jennifer would attend, engineering casual encounters. In July 2002, He'd asked her to meet him, claiming he needed advice about Emma. Jennifer had agreed, kind and trusting as always. They'd met in the parking lot of the tavern after she left her friends. David said he'd suggested they drive somewhere quieter to talk, and Jennifer had followed him in her car to the trail system behind the railway tracks. He claimed he'd only wanted to talk, to tell her how he felt, to see if she might be interested in him. But Jennifer had been uncomfortable, had told him she wasn't interested, that he was married, that this was inappropriate. She'd tried to leave. David said something in him had snapped. The rejection, the stress of his failing business, the pressure of his deteriorating marriage, it all came together in that moment. He grabbed her, tried to make her stay, tried to make her understand. She'd fought back. He'd panicked. He put his hands around her throat to stop her from screaming, and he hadn't stopped squeezing until she went limp. Afterward, he'd driven her car to the barn, wiped it down best he could, walked back to his own vehicle he'd left near the trail. He'd gone home, climbed into bed next to his sleeping wife, and lived with what he'd done every day since. The confession was detailed, remorseless in its honesty, but also strangely detached, as if David was talking about someone else's actions rather than his own. Investigators asked why he'd attended her funeral, why he'd expressed sympathy to her family. David said he'd had to, that not going would have seemed suspicious, that he'd needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He said he'd thought about confessing many times over the years, especially when he saw Tom Hayes at community events, aging and broken by grief. But he never found the courage. He convinced himself that he could live with it, that time would make it easier. It never did. The guilt, he said, was constant, a weight that colored everything, but apparently not constant enough to make him turn himself in, not heavy enough to overcome his instinct for self-preservation. He'd chosen his own freedom over Jennifer's family's peace, every day for 22 years. The news of David Brennan's arrest and confession spread through Millbrook like wildfire, but the reaction wasn't the simple relief you might expect. There was satisfaction, yes, that the case was finally solved, that Jennifer's killer had been identified and would face justice. But there was also shock, betrayal, a collective horror at realizing they'd been living alongside a murderer for decades. Parents who trusted David with their taxes felt sick thinking about having welcomed him into their homes. Neighbors who chatted with him over backyard fences felt deceived, violated. Emma Brennan, his daughter, released a statement through a lawyer saying she was devastated and cooperating fully with authorities, that she'd had no knowledge of her father's crime and would need time to process the destruction of everything she'd believed about the man who raised her. Linda Brennan filed for divorce within a week, her own statement brief and anguished, expressing sympathy for the Hayes family and shock at discovering she'd been married to a stranger. The community that had been fractured by Jennifer's murder in 2002 was fractured again by the revelation of who had taken her life. For Tom and Patricia Hayes, now in their 70s and long past the point where they'd expected to see justice, the arrest brought complicated emotions. There was relief, overwhelming relief, that they finally knew what had happened to their daughter, that the question that had tormented them for over 2 decades finally had an answer. There was satisfaction that David Brennan would be punished, would spend the rest of his life in prison for what he'd done. But there was also renewed grief, a reopening of wounds that had never really healed. Learning that Jennifer had died because she'd been kind enough to meet with a parent concerned about his daughter, that her empathy and trust had been weaponized against her, made her death seem even more senseless. Tom told reporters that he remembered David from the funeral, remembered shaking his hand, remembered David saying how sorry he was. The thought of that moment now, understanding that David had been the one who'd killed Jennifer, made him physically ill. Patricia said she'd spent 22 years imagining the person who murdered her daughter as a monster, some evil stranger who'd emerged from the darkness. Learning that he was someone ordinary, someone who'd seemed normal and kind, someone who'd lived a regular life while their family was destroyed, was almost harder to accept. Evil, she said, isn't always obvious. Sometimes it wears a friendly face and coaches your kid's baseball team. David Brennan was charged with first-degree murder in April 2024. He pled guilty, sparing the Hayes family the ordeal of a trial. In July, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He'll be in his 80s before he's even eligible for a hearing, and given the nature of his crime and the decades he spent evading justice, parole seems unlikely. During the sentencing hearing, Tom and Patricia gave victim impact statements, their voices steady despite their pain. Tom said that David had stolen not just Jennifer's life, but the life their family should have had, all the moments they should have experienced with her. Birthdays, holidays, her wedding, grandchildren they would never have. Patricia looked directly at David and told him she forgave him, not for his sake, but for her own peace, but that forgiveness didn't mean she would ever forget what he'd taken from them. David sat through the statements with his head down, offering no response, no explanation that could possibly justify what he'd done. When given the chance to speak, he said only that he was sorry, that he'd thought about Jennifer every day, that he knew nothing he could say would matter. Then he was led away to begin serving his sentence, disappearing into the prison system, becoming a number and a cautionary tale. The resolution of Jennifer Hayes' case became one of dozens that year, part of a growing wave of cold cases being solved through forensic genetic genealogy. Across North America, families who'd waited decades for answers were finally getting them, finally seeing justice for their loved ones. The technology that had seemed like science fiction in 2002 was now routine, a standard tool in the investigator's arsenal. Detective James Chen retired 6 months after David's sentencing. His final case finally closed, Jennifer's photo coming down from his bulletin board at last. He attended the retirement party his colleagues threw him, accepted the watch and the speeches. But he said later that the real satisfaction was simpler than all that. It was calling Tom and Patricia Hayes after the arrest, and hearing Patricia cry with relief on the other end of the line. It was knowing that Jennifer's case wouldn't remain in that banker's box forever, unsolved and forgotten. She was remembered. She mattered. And ultimately, after 22 years, the truth had found its way into the light. On a cool October afternoon in 2024, Tom and Patricia Hayes visited Jennifer's grave at Millbrook Cemetery for what felt like the first time they could truly say goodbye. They brought flowers like always, the daisies that had been her favorite. But this time, they also brought closure. They told her that the person who'd taken her life was in prison, that justice had been served, that she could rest now. Patricia placed her hand on the headstone and said that maybe they could rest too, just a little, after all these years of not knowing. The wind moved through the maple trees overhead, leaves beginning to turn gold and red with the changing season. Time had passed, would keep passing, the world moving forward like it always does. But in that moment, standing at their daughter's grave with answers they thought would never come, Tom and Patricia Hayes felt something they hadn't felt since July 2002. They felt peace. Not complete, not perfect, but real. And for a family that had lived with uncertainty and anguish for over 2 decades, peace was enough. Sometimes the truth takes years to emerge, buried under lies and time, an ordinary life continuing like nothing happened. But DNA doesn't forget. Science doesn't get tired or move on to other cases. And somewhere in the genetic code we all carry, justice was waiting, patient and inevitable, ready to speak for those who no longer could.